The rumor said 60 aircraft. Then it said 124. Then it climbed past 140. Brand new Spitfires, still in their factory grease, sealed inside wooden crates, and lowered into the red earth of Burma, left to rot in the ground rather than face the enemy again. For nearly 70 years, nobody could prove it. For nearly 70 years, nobody could disprove it either. And in January of 2013, a retired farmer from Lincolnshire stood on a runway in Yangon, surrounded by cameras, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of excavators, convinced he was seconds away from the greatest warbird discovery in history. What he found instead would humble him, humiliate a video game company, and expose one of the most persistent myths of the Second World War. This is the story of the Spitfires that were never supposed to be found, because maybe they were never there at all. To understand why anyone believed 60, then 100, then possibly hundreds of pristine fighter planes were buried in the Burmese jungle, you first have to understand what the Spitfire meant to Britain, and what the end of the war did to its machines of victory. The Supermarine Spitfire was not just an aircraft, it was the symbol of survival itself. In the summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe darkened the skies over southern England, it was the Spitfire's narrow elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that helped turn back an invasion Hitler believed was inevitable. By the time the war reached its final phase in the Far East, the Spitfire had evolved dramatically. The Mark 14 variant, powered by the massive Griffon engine, was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything that had flown over Kent in the Battle of Britain. Thousands of these late-model Spitfires were built in factories across Britain between 1944 and 1945, many of them shipped in pieces, crated, cocooned in protective wax and paper, waiting to be assembled in forward air bases across India and Burma to support the brutal campaign against Japan. The war in Burma was one of the most grueling theaters of the entire conflict. Monsoon rains turned roads into rivers. Malaria and dysentery killed as many soldiers as bullets did. British, Indian, and American forces fought through dense jungle against a Japanese army that rarely surrendered. Air power was essential, and airfields like Mingaladon outside Rangoon and Myitkyina in the north became vital hubs where aircraft arrived by the crate load, ready to be uncrated and flown into combat. By mid-1945, factories back home were still producing Spitfires at a blistering pace, and shipments kept crossing the ocean toward a war that everyone assumed still had years left to run. Military planners were preparing for Operation Zipper, the amphibious invasion of Malaya, and beyond that, the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands, a campaign expected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Nobody in the spring of 1945 believed the war was close to over. And that miscalculation is exactly why what happened next became such a logistical catastrophe. Then, in the span of a few weeks, everything stopped. Germany had already surrendered in May. On August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio, announcing surrender. The war that was supposed to grind on for years ended almost overnight. And across Burma, India, and the Pacific, that sudden silence created a problem nobody had planned for. What do you do with an army's worth of brand new equipment that the war no longer needs? Factories back in Britain had already shipped enormous quantities of aircraft, engines, ammunition, and spare parts to depots across the Far East, all of it built for a fight that had just vanished. Military logisticians who had spent years obsessed with production quotas were suddenly obsessed with disposal. Warehouses in Rangoon and beyond were reportedly overflowing with unassembled aircraft still in their factory crates. Equipment that had cost the British taxpayer a fortune. Equipment that now had nowhere to go and no war left to fight in. Shipping space to bring it all home was scarce and expensive. Some of it, according to the men who were there, never left Burma at all. This is where the legend begins, with human memory, not paperwork. In the 1990s, an aviation historian and wreck hunter named Jim Pierce was speaking with a group of American veterans who told him something extraordinary. They said they had personally been ordered, in the final months of 1945, to bury crated Spitfires in the ground rather than ship them home. Pierce shared that story with a friend, a Lincolnshire farmer, pilot, and aviation enthusiast named David Cundall. Cundall became obsessed. Over the following years, he gathered eyewitness accounts, not just from American engineers, but from British and local Burmese witnesses too, describing crates being lowered into pits at airfields, including Mingaladon near Rangoon, Meiktila in central Burma, and Myatkina in the north. One of those witnesses, a British veteran named Stanley Coombe, insisted for decades that he had personally seen the burial take place. According to the story that took hold, the order to bury the aircraft came from the very top, from Lord Louis Mountbatten himself, the Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command, who, the legend claimed, ordered the planes interred rather than risk them falling into the wrong hands, or simply because there was no practical way left to transport them. For nearly 2 decades, Cundall poured his own money and time into chasing the rumor. He commissioned surveys. He made a dozen trips to Burma over 16 years, spending well over £100,000 of his own money and negotiating with a government that had, for most of that time, been one of the most closed and secretive regimes on earth. Myanmar, as Burma was renamed by its military junta, was not exactly an easy place to run an archaeological expedition. Political isolation, sanctions, and bureaucratic suspicion made access nearly impossible for years. But when Myanmar began cautiously opening to the outside world in the early 2000s, Cundall finally saw his opportunity. And then something happened that turned a farmer's decades-long obsession into an international media sensation. A video game company decided to bankroll the dig. Wargaming.net, the Belarusian company behind the online game World of Tanks, agreed to fund the expedition, seeing an irresistible marketing opportunity in the hunt for lost World War II treasure. Tracy Spate, the company's director of special projects, joined Cundall on site, inspecting a model of a Spitfire as the team prepared to search the ground where they believed the aircraft were hidden. The team believed that more than 120 unused Spitfires could be buried across several sites in Burma, roughly 18 believed to be at Myatkina, 36 believed to be at Rangoon's International Airport, and more at Meiktila. Geophysicists from the University of Leeds conducted ground surveys. British engineering company JCB provided excavation equipment. 91-year-old veteran Stanley Coombe travelled back to Burma to stand at the site he claimed to have witnessed nearly 70 years earlier. The press coverage was enormous. Newspapers across the world ran headlines promising the recovery of a lost squadron, aircraft that could be worth millions once restored to flying condition. It felt, for a few weeks in January 2013, like the discovery of the century was finally about to happen. The dig began at Mingaladon, now the site of Yangon International Airport. Cameras were lowered into a crate discovered at Myatkina, but muddy water made it impossible to see what, if anything, was inside. Cundall told reporters it was very encouraging, insisting that once the water was pumped out, they would find the aircraft in pristine condition. But as the excavation widened, something felt wrong. By mid-January, the team had dug up nothing but scraps of metal sheeting. No wings, no fuselages, no engines, just fragments that told no clear story at all. Then came the moment nobody in Cundall's camp wanted to hear. Archaeologists on the ground concluded that the evidence simply did not support the original claim that as many as 124 Spitfires had ever been buried at the sites they were digging. Wargaming.net, the company financing the entire operation, publicly stated there were no planes to be found. A scheduled press conference meant to announce the discovery instead became the moment the dream collapsed in front of the world's media. Cundall refused to accept it. He told the BBC he felt deeply frustrated, but insisted the team had simply been searching in the wrong place, and when asked directly whether he would apologize if he turned out to be wrong, he said he would, adding that he believed it was better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all. But for the archaeologists standing in that trench, the verdict was already in. There were no Spitfires under Yangon International Airport. There may never have been. Kundal didn't stop. Refusing to let 17 years of searching end in an empty pit, he insisted the aircraft must simply be buried closer to the modern runway than anyone had calculated, even after funding for the excavation was cut off following the failed dig. Later that year, a new backer stepped in. An American logistics company called Clarendon Logistics agreed to sponsor a second attempt, and Kundal returned to Rangoon in December of 2013 with a new plan, boring narrow holes through the concrete and lowering cameras down to photograph whatever lay beneath, rather than risk damaging the runway with wide excavation. It was smaller, quieter, more desperate. The boreholes turned up only a few scraps of metal, nothing more. Then, early in 2014, Burmese authorities withheld permission to continue digging altogether, and Kundal suspected, without proof, that the government might be quietly negotiating with rival treasure hunters instead. The trail, in every practical sense, went cold. So what actually happened to the aircraft the veterans swore they buried with their own hands? This is where the story gets more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics like to admit. It's entirely true that Britain, like the United States, faced an overwhelming surplus crisis at the end of the war across every theater, not just Burma. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition that had been produced in staggering quantities suddenly had no purpose and, in many cases, no economical way home. Some equipment was sold off cheaply to allies and former enemies alike. Some was scrapped for raw materials, melted down at a fraction of what it cost to build. Some genuinely was buried or dumped, not out of secrecy, but because it was often cheaper to bury unusable material in soft ground near a base than to ship it thousands of miles back to a country already drowning in surplus stock of its own. Veterans who remembered burying crates in 1945 were very likely telling the truth about something. The question was never whether burials happened somewhere in the aftermath of the war. The question was whether the specific, pristine, still-in-the-crate Spitfires from Kundal's legend were ever real, and the physical evidence, after millions of dollars and years of digging, said no. Historians who later examined the story in detail, including researchers who worked directly on the wargaming-funded excavation, concluded that the myth had likely grown in the retelling, the way folklore always does, gathering specificity and drama with each decade that passed. A story that may have begun with a handful of damaged or unusable aircraft parts being disposed of in the ground morphed, over 50 years of retelling among veterans, enthusiasts, and eventually journalists hungry for a headline, into a legend of 140 pristine, flight-ready Spitfires waiting beneath the tarmac like a buried treasure chest. The story wasn't a lie, exactly. It was something more interesting than that. A memory reshaped by hope, repeated so many times it hardened into a fact that never quite was one. The 5 surprising truths buried inside this saga are almost stranger than the myth itself. First, the amount of money and effort poured into finding these aircraft was staggering. Years of a private citizen's life savings, a multinational corporation's marketing budget, university geophysicists, and a UK engineering giant, all chasing a rumor that began as second-hand conversation between old soldiers. Second, the eyewitnesses were not con artists. Men like Stanley Coombe went to their graves believing what they told reporters, genuinely certain of what they remembered, a sobering reminder of just how convincingly human memory can rewrite the past, especially across 7 decades. Third, the geopolitical timing was almost as improbable as the treasure hunt itself. The The dig only became possible because Myanmar's military government began cautiously easing decades of isolation at almost the exact moment Kundal's persistence finally paid off. Fourth, the true fate of Britain's surplus military hardware after 1945 is a far bigger and stranger story than any single buried squadron, encompassing scrapped tanks melted for scrap metal, aircraft sold at bargain prices to fledgling foreign air forces, and depots of ammunition dumped at sea. And fifth, perhaps most tellingly, no wreck, no wing, no engine block matching a World War II Spitfire has ever been recovered from Burmese soil to this day, despite one of the most well-funded, well-publicized archaeological searches in aviation history. The legacy of the buried Spitfire myth outlives its own debunking, genuine Mark 14. Spitfires do still exist today, not unearthed from Burmese mud, but preserved by collectors, restored by specialist workshops, and flown at air shows across Britain, cared for by people who spent fortunes keeping wartime engineering alive in the sky rather than searching for it underground. The story of Kundal's search has itself become a cautionary case study, taught to archaeologists and historians as an example of how folklore, wishful thinking, and modern media can combine to create a discovery with no discovery at all. And it raises an uncomfortable question that reaches beyond one farmer's obsession in Lincolnshire. How many other legends of the Second World War, hidden gold, buried treasure, secret bunkers, are built on exactly this same foundation? A grain of truth, a war's worth of chaos, and 70 years of retelling until the story became more real than the evidence ever was. David Kundal never found his Spitfires, he never got his apology from history, and he never quite gave up either, insisting until the very end that he was simply digging in the wrong spot. Maybe he was. Maybe somewhere beneath the runways of Yangon, or in some forgotten strip of jungle nobody has surveyed yet, there really is a crate of Griffin engine fighters still waiting in the dark, exactly as the old soldiers swore. Or maybe the truth is quieter and sadder than that. A handful of scrapped, unusable parts, buried in haste by exhausted men in the final chaotic weeks of a 6-year war, remembered decades later as something far grander than it ever was. Either way, the legend of the buried Spitfires tells us something true about war's endings that has nothing to do with buried treasure at all. That the moment the fighting stops is rarely as clean as the history books make it sound, and that sometimes the most enduring mysteries of World War II aren't the ones we've solved. They're the ones we've simply stopped looking for. If this story pulled you into one of history's strangest treasure hunts, you'll want to see the next one, because the war left behind far more unanswered questions than this. Subscribe, and let's go find them.